Welcome to Smart Consulting Sourcing. This is a podcast where we talk about how companies actually buy consulting. Know how the process looks on paper, but how it really works once you add people, politics, vague objective, and the occasional we'll figure it out later. I'm Hélène Lafitte, CEO at Consulting Quest, and we spend most of our time helping organizations make sense of their consulting spend and of the projects behind. If you haven't already, I recommend subscribing. This is the first episode of a series, and it's very much meant to be followed over time. Today's episode is called How to Buy Consulting in the Age of AI. Smarter, faster, still human. And I want to start by addressing a concern that seems to come up every time AI enters the conversation. No. AI is not going to replace procurement, at least not in consulting. And if anything, it's finally going to make procurement sound like it has read its own RFP. Consulting is not a category where you can automate your way to brilliance. Every project is different. The problems are rarely well defined at the start, and half of the value sits somewhere between judgment, framing, and knowing where a stakeholder is asking for clarity or for cover. So when people say AI is going to disrupt consulting procurement, they usually mean one of three things. Either they haven't bought consulting recently, they're confusing speed with thinking, or they're themselves consultants for AI implementation. That said, AI does change something important, not by taking over decisions, but by giving procurement more bandwidth, more structure, and occasionally the courage to ask the better questions. In this episode, I'll explain why AI won't replace buyers, but can be a very effective sparring partner. We'll look at how it helps procurement challenge fuzzy briefs, stress test assumptions, and make sense of complexity without pretending everything is suddenly objective and data-driven. And we'll also talk about its blind spots, bias, hallucination, and that impressive ability to sound confident while being completely wrong. This series is not a node to algorithm, it's a practical, slightly cynical field guide for procurement leaders who want to use AI as a mirror, not a crutch. But used AI doesn't just save time. It forces discipline, and discipline in procurement is already a small revolution. So let's start at the beginning. Why AI won't replace buyers, and that's actually good news. Let's start with this idea that refused to die. AI is going to replace procurement. More specifically, that is going to replace buyers when it comes to consulting. And that's an appealing idea. It's clean, it's efficient, it's comforting in a way. And if buying consulting were just about processing information faster, comparing options objectively, and selecting the best answer, then yes, AI would probably do a decent job. Possibly a better one than most humans, especially on the morning, me in particular. So the problem is that buying consulting has never worked like that. Consulting projects don't start with a clear problem statement. They start with a feeling. Something isn't working. Something needs to change. Someone upstairs wants a transformation, but nobody has quite agreed on what that means yet. And somehow procurement is expected to turn that into a scope, a sourcing process, and a rational decision. That's not a data problem. That's a human one. And when people say AI will replace buyer, they usually imagine procurement as a purely transactional function, something that takes inputs, applies rules, and produces output. That version of procurement does exist. It's just not the one that deals with consulting in a meaningful way. In consulting, the hardest part is not analyzing proposal. It's framing the question in the first place. It's understanding what the business is really asking for as opposed to what it's comfortable saying out loud. It's spotting when a project is about solving a problem and when it's about buying reassurance, legitimacy all the time. AI is very good at working with what's written. It's much less good at dealing with what's implied. It doesn't hear the hesitation in the steering committee meeting. It doesn't notice when three stakeholders agree enthusiastically but for the three completely different reasons. It doesn't feel the political weight behind we've always worked with that firm. And that's why that AI, the idea that AI will simply replace buyer in consulting procurement is not just wrong, it's a misunderstanding of where the value of the buyer actually sits. The buyer's value isn't in pushing the process forward, it's in slowing down at the right moment, asking the uncomfortable question, pointing out that the scope doesn't quite match the ambition, or that the ambition doesn't quite match reality. And this is where things get interesting. Because while AI won't replace that role, it does change the conditions around it. It removes a lot of the busy work. It structures information faster, it fosters clarity where there used to be vagueness. And sometimes it asks a question that procurement didn't dare to ask because now it's just a tool. So the threat is not that AI will replace buyer. The real threat is that it will expose which buyer were only ever managing the process and not the thinking. And that's exactly where we'll go next. How AI used properly doesn't just automate things, it sharpens it. So if AI doesn't replace buyer, the obvious next question is, so what does it actually do? And the honest answer is, it changes the conversation. Not by being smarter than procurement, but by relentlessly annoying in a very specific way. AI has no problem asking basic questions over and over again. What's the objective? What does success look like? What's the constraint? What happens if nothing changes? Human tends to stop asking those questions much earlier, usually because some senior leader has already answered them once, or because asking again feels like inconvenient. This is where AI becomes useful, not because it knows the answer, but because it doesn't get tired of the question. Take something very simple like the early stages of a consulting project. The briefing usually starts as a collection of slides, emails, and half-formed ideas. Everyone agrees that the project is important. Fewer people agree on why. And even fewer agree on what would count as a good outcome. When procurement use AI at that stage, something interesting happens. You can take all the input, the messy version, and ask the tool to structure it, rephrase it, or summarize it back to you. And suddenly, the gaps become visible. Not because AI is insightful, but because it's literal. It forces the question, is it actually a scope or just a list of intention? Is it a problem statement or a strategy wish list? Are we buying expertise, capacity, legitimacy, or all of the three without even saying it? And sometimes it does something even more basic and more useful. It helps procurement understand what is actually being said. Not because stakeholders are unclear on purpose, but because business language has a talent for sounding precise while remaining deeply ambiguous. You get objectives that are actually symptoms, constraints, desires of preferences, and requests for support that are really requests for arbitration. Running that input through AI, asking it to rephrase, simplify, or explain the briefing as if it were meant for someone outside the room, often reveals a quiet truth. Half of the confusion is not strategic, it's linguistic. And AI is very good at translating corporate dialect into plain logic. And once you see that translation, it becomes much easier to ask the right follow-up question, or to realize that three people have been asking for three different things under the same heading, right? And that's uncomfortable. And that's exactly the point. AI is very good at holding up a mirror, and procurement doesn't always love what it sees. The same thing happens when challenging stakeholder input. Traditionally, pushing back on a brief can feel political. You don't want to sound obstructive, you don't want to be that person. But when you use AI to test the logic of a brief, to ask whether the objectives are coherent, whether the assumption hold, whether the timeline makes sense, the challenge becomes more impersonal. It's no longer procurement questioning the business, it's the tool highlighting its consistencies. And that small shift matters a lot. It gives procurement cover, and it gives procurement structure. And occasionally, it gives procurement the confidence to say, if we launch this as is, we're going to get exactly the kind of proposal we'll complain about later. AI also changed how procurement prepares itself. Beyond buyers no longer need to spend hours formatting, rewording, or consolidating documents just to get to a usable starting point. That time can be spent where it actually adds value, thinking through trade-offs, identifying risks, and deciding what really needs to be decided. And this is where the idea of AI as a sparring partner becomes useful. A sparring partner doesn't fight the match for you, but it forces you to sharpen your arguments, to tighten your logic, and notice when you're weak. AI does that by asking naive questions with alarming confidence. And while that confidence should never be trusted blindly, the questions themselves are often exactly the ones procurement should be asking away. The danger, of course, is when people mistake structure for judgment. Because AI will happily generate a beautiful written scope that makes absolutely no sense in reality. It will summarize flawed assumptions with the same enthusiasm as solid ones. And it will never tell you this is politically impossible or this stakeholder will never buy into this. And that's not a bug, that's the boundary. So used AI doesn't make procurement faster by skipping thinking. It makes procurement faster by forcing thinking earlier, more explicitly, and sometimes more honestly than the organization is comfortable with. And that's why AI is not a replacement for buyers, but a provocation. It pushes procurement into the role it always claimed to have, not just running the process, but shaping the decision. Which brings us to the next step in the journey, the place where AI is most tempting, most useful, and most dangerous at the same time, writing the RFP. So let's talk about RFP, because this is usually where good intentions go to die. Most consulting RFP don't start as documents, they start as compromises. A slide from strategy, a paragraph from finance, a few bullet points from IT, and a deadline that assumes clarity will magically appear on its own. And procurement job is then to turn all of that into something coherent while being told, often in the same sentence, to be fast, flexible, and very precise. And this is where AI can genuinely help. Not by writing the RFP for you, but by forcing you to confront what you've actually been given. If you feed AI a pile of stakeholder input and ask it to structure it, something useful happens. The tool doesn't know what matters politically, but is very good at exposing logical tension. It will happily point out that your objectives don't align with your scope, that your timeline contradicts your ambition, or that you're asking for both innovation and zero risk in the same breath. That's not AI being smart, that's AI being literal. And used properly, it becomes a very efficient way for procurement to challenge the brief before it becomes public. Not by saying this doesn't work, but by saying if we publish this as is, here is what it actually says. And sometimes the result is even more uncomfortable. The realization that there isn't really a scope yet. Just a direction, a hope, and a vague sense that consultant will help figure it out. Which is fine, as long as you're honest about it. AI is particularly good at helping procurement clear-cut language without sanitizing the problem. It can rephrase, simplify, or restate the scope in plain terms, which makes it much easier to spot what's missing. Success criteria that aren't defined, deliverables that are aspirational rather than measurable, and constraints that are implied but never stated. This is also where AI helps procurement stop playing editor and start playing architect. Instead of spending time rewriting sentences, buyer can use AI to test different framing. What happens if we describe the problem differently? What if we separate diagnosis from delivery? What if we admit uncertainty instead of pretending it doesn't exist? And you can do this quickly, quietly, and before anyone outside the organization sees the document, which means procurement can come back to stakeholders with options. And that's a key difference. AI doesn't turn a weak brief into a strong one, but it makes weaknesses visible early enough to fix them. And that alone changes the quality of what comes back from the market. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most bad consulting proposals are not the fault of consultants. There is a very rational response to a confused RFP. If the brief is fuzzy, consultants will fill in the gaps with assumptions, frameworks, and a healthy layer of marketing. If the objectives are contradictory, proposal will be too. And if success isn't defined, everything will look successful on paper. AI won't stop that by itself, but it gives procurement a way to intervene before the damage is done. Of course, there's a trap here, and it's an easy one to fall into. AI will happily generate a beautifully structured RFP that looks solid, sounds confident, and is completely disconnected from organizational reality. It won't tell you that the stakeholders aren't aligned, that the timeline is politically driven, or that half the scope depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. That's why AI is a drafting tool and not a truth teller. And used well, it can help procurement move from a blank page to a sharp scope faster, with fewer blind spots and fewer late surprises. Used badly, it just produces a more elegant Frankenstein, stitched together, impressive looking, and still very much alive. And once the RFP is out in the world, the next temptation appears almost immediately, using AI to find the right consulting firm. Indeed, once the RFP is ready, the next temptation is obvious. You have a clear skill a clean scope, a clear structure, and now a tool that can find the best consulting firm in seconds. And that's where AI starts to look dangerously impressive. Ask it for firm in strategy, transformation, data, sustainability, whatever your topic is. And it will give you a list, polished, confident, reassuringly familiar. The usual suspects, most of you name you half recognize and feel good about not recognizing too much. And that's exactly where procurement needs to slow down. Because what AI is really doing here is not mapping the consulting market. It's mapping the visible consulting market. AI is very good at what's already being written, indexed, optimized, and repeated, which means it naturally favors firms that are large, loud, marketed, and very good at describing themselves as leading. That doesn't make the list wrong, it just makes it incomplete. And the risk is subtle but real. If procurement relies too heavily on AI at this stage, it doesn't expand the supply universe, it standardizes it. You end up with a shortlist that looks modern, data-driven, and slightly more diverse than last year, but still very safe. And safety in consulting is not the same thing as relevance. This is where human judgment has to come back in. Not to dismiss what AI produces, but to interrogate it. Why these firms? What kind of work do they actually deliver? Who will really show up on the project? And just as importantly, who isn't on the list and why? AI can help procurement surface them faster. It can help cluster firms by capability, geography, and state expertise. It can even help identify patterns. For instance, which firms tend to show up together in similar searches. What it cannot do is separate marketing fluency from delivery depth. It doesn't know which boutique quietly does exceptional work because they don't spend time feeding algorithm. It doesn't know which partner consistently overpromises and which firm sends the A team to pitch and the B team to deliver. And it certainly doesn't understand chemistry, trust, and political fit. And that's not a failure of AI. That's a reminder of what procurement is actually there to do. So use AI becomes a starting point for supplier exploration. It gives procurement a broader map, but not the compass. The compass is still experience, networks, and the ability to ask questions that aren't written anywhere. And this is where the real opportunity sits. AI allows procurement to say, hey, here's the obvious market. And human judgment allows procurement to say, and here's what's missing. And when you combine the two, you don't just get faster sourcing, you get smarter sourcing. You widen the conversation instead of narrowing it. And you avoid mistaking algorithmic confidence for market truth. Which brings us naturally to the next challenge. Once proposals start coming back, because sorting, comparing, and analyzing them with AI looks very tempting and slightly dangerous. And it feels like a miracle when the proposals start coming in. You have 10 documents, sometimes 20, different formats, different structures, different ways of saying roughly the same thing. This is where procurement has traditionally spent a lot of time doing work that is necessary, but not especially enlightening. So yes, this is the one of the areas where AI genuinely shines. It can summarize proposals quickly. It can compare scopes, pricing models, timelines, staffing assumptions. It can highlight differences that are hard to see when you 10 document deep and slightly regretting your life choices. Used properly, AI becomes a very effective bias buster. It doesn't care about brand prestige. It doesn't get impressed by glossy language. And it doesn't assume that the most expensive option must also be the most strategic, at least not by itself. The problem starts when people forget what AI is actually doing at this stage. It's not evaluating proposal, it's organizing information. And the two things are often confused, sometimes deliberately. AI will happily tell you which proposal is the most comprehensive, the most detailed, or the most aligned with the status scope. What it cannot tell you is whether that scope made sense in the first place, whether the proposal that looks weaker on paper is actually the one that understood the problem best. And then there's confidence. AI is extremely good at summarizing nonsense with total composure. If a proposal is vague, contradictory, or built on heroic assumptions, AI won't raise an eyebrow. It will rephrase it politely, balance it against the others, and move on. Which means that without human judgment, AI doesn't eliminate that thinking. It just standardizes it. And this is where procurement has to stay firmly in the driver's seat. Used well, AI helps buyers prepare better compensation. It allows procurement to go back to stakeholders with structured comparisons, clear trade-offs, and very precise questions. Why is the timeline half as long? Why is the team twice the size? Why does everyone assume the same dependency is out of scope? That's valuable, that's strategic, and that's exactly where procurement should be. But used badly, AI becomes a decision shield, a way of saying the tutoring is this way instead of owing the choice. And that's a very tempting shortcut, especially when the decision is politically sensitive. But consulting decisions are never neutral. Pretending otherwise doesn't make them more objective, it just makes them less accountable. AI can help procurement remove noise, reduce bias, and surface inconsistencies. What it cannot do is decide which risk is acceptable, which compromise is worth making, or which team will actually work with the business once the contract is signed. That's still human call. So the smart way to use AI here is not to ask which proposal is best, but what should we be debating? And that's a very different and much more interesting question. Because once you get that, AI stops being a judge and becomes what it's actually good at, a very efficient assistant helping procurement turn information into insight and insight into real decision. Which leaves us with one last topic before we wrap up this manifesto, where AI stops being useful altogether and where procurement absolutely needs to stay skeptical. At this point, it should be fairly clear where AI helps and just as importantly, where it doesn't. AI is very good at structure, it's very good at speed, it's very good at forcing clarity where there was vagueness. What it's not good at is judgment. It doesn't understand what a project is technically sound, but politically fragile. It doesn't understand when a stakeholder is aligned in principle, but not in practice. And it has no instinct for when a reasonable compromise today will quietly undermine delivery 6 months from now. Those things don't live in the data, they live in experience. This is where procurement still matters and where it actually has an advantage that's been underestimated for years. Procurement sits at the intersection of ambition and constraint. It sees patterns across projects, remembers what went wrong last time, and understands how decisions play out beyond the steering committee deck. AI doesn't replace that. It gives procurement the ability to say with more confidence and less friction, let's slow down here, the assumption doesn't hold, or we're about to optimize the wrong thing. And perhaps more importantly, it removes the convenient excuse you can no longer hide behind complexity or volume or lack of time. When AI takes care of the mechanics, what's left is the thinking. And that's where procurement either steps up or gets exposed. So no, AI won't replace procurement, but it will make it harder to pretend that procurement is only about running the process, which frankly is long overdue. So that's the starting point for this series. AI won't disrupt consulting procurement by automating decisions. It will upgrade it by forcing more rigor, better questions, and clearer conversation with stakeholders who used to bypass procurement altogether. And in the next episode, we'll get much more concrete. We'll look at how AI can help you move from a blank page to a sharp scope, and why most RFPs fail, not because of poor writing, but because of poor thinking upstream. So if this episode resonated, subscribe to Smart Consulting Sourcing. The rest of the series builds from there. And if you want to continue the conversation, you'll find us at Consulting Quest, where we help organizations by consulting more intelligently with or without AI. Thank you for listening. Stay smart, sue smart, and au revoir.